Thanks everyone for watching this Axiomatics recording. Today we're going to talk about attribute-based access control for applications, but also for databases. And the products we'll be featuring today are at the Axiomatics Policy Server as well as the Axiomatics Data Access Filter. And we'll go through and show you how we're protecting access within a three-tier application. The use case that we'll be using as an example today, from a high level, it's a car retail company. It has a web application that has three different tiers, as we mentioned. Users can access this application to create, to view, and approve purchase orders if they follow the proper policy rules that are set up in the Axiomatics system. So first we're going to talk a little bit more about the use case and identify some of the data and the different authorization rules that we want to implement for this demo. So this is Acme Incorporated. It's a tremendous used car retailer company, the world's best, of course. They've decided to build a new web portal for sales and other employees to use. It'll be mobile friendly. It'll be responsive to different business changes that typically take place in a very dynamic work environment. Some of the issues that they're looking to provide here or to provide for include security, fraud prevention, as well as customer privacy. So what they've decided to do is to externalize the authorization using the ABAC model. As we've seen in other presentations, is a huge trend in the industry today. So when we go through the demo, you'll see that users of the portal can access certain purchase orders. They can also access and create sales contracts. The POs and the sales contracts are the things we're going to be looking at that need the fine-grained access control. The users will be either an employee of Acme or they will be an administrator of the system.
All right, thanks, Gerry. And if we look more specifically at the data at hand here, the first item we'll be focusing on is the resource, which in this case is a purchase order. We will be describing the purchase order in terms of its attributes, such as the amount of the purchase order, its location, its creator, its status, and also its identity. The identity will be used to retrieve the additional attributes or the additional metadata about the purchase order. But in this case, it's not just about the resource, it's also about the user, the subject, and in this case, the user logging into the web application, be it a customer or an employee. This is an employee portal, so it will focus on employees. And the attributes of the employees that will matter and the scenarios will be the identity of the employee, the department, the location, the approval limit of that employee, and also their role. Additional attributes include action attributes, such as the type of action we're dealing with, creating the purchase order, viewing the purchase order, or approving the purchase order. Lastly, we can bring in contextual attributes or environment attributes, such as the type of device being used, the IP address of the user, the time of the day, and many more. This is great because here we're building a mobile-friendly portal, so we might want to make some authorization decisions based on the type of device we're dealing with. The first rule that we have is very simple. The great thing about attribute-based access control and the extensible access control markup language that we use behind the scenes to implement ABAC is that it's pretty much like English. There's a fairly close relationship between the technical language and the original English policy or rule. But with ABAC, what we can do is pull out the highlighter and identify the keywords, the building blocks of the sentence. Those building blocks are in fact the attributes that brought together determine the authorization policy. Here we have a user attribute, the purchasing department. It describes the user who is currently logged in. We have an action attribute, create. It's the value of the action that the user wants to do. And we have purchase orders, the resource, an attribute of the resource category, the type of resource. If you think about it, the subject attributes, the action attributes, and the resource attributes are in fact related to the subject from a grammatical perspective, the verb from a grammatical perspective, and the object from a grammatical perspective. As you can see, it is very easy to go from a plain old English sentence to an ABAC-minded sentence, and from there to exactable authorization policy. This is the first rule that we have. We will implement it in the demo, and we will see the impact it has on the UI. The second rule that we're going to be using is a user in the purchasing department can view purchase orders if and only if the purchase order and the user are in the same location. Here we're expanding the rule and adding a relationship between the user and the purchase order. Let's walk through the rule and highlight the keywords. First of all, again, purchasing department describes the subject, view is the action, purchase orders, again, the resource. And now we enter the relationship part of the rule, where same location, in fact, is an attribute of two categories, if you like. But you could break it down into two separate attributes. The purchase order location on the one hand, which belongs to the resource category, and the user location on the other, which belongs, of course, to the subject category. The third rule that will come into play in this demonstration is the following. This third rule illustrates the fact that you can add additional constraints to basic rule. Basic rule, a manager in the purchasing department can approve purchase orders. Constraint number 1, up to their approval limit. Number 2, if and only if the PO location and the user's location are the same. And number 3, if and only if the user is not the PO purchaser. The first constraint is a typical approval transaction limit or limit on a transaction that one is allowed to approve. The second one is the location check we were doing in rule number 2. We're being consistent. And the third constraint here is a segregation of duty check. Let's highlight the keywords. Manager describes the subject. Purchasing department describes the subject. Approve is the action. Purchase order is the resource. Approval limit describes the subject again. PO location relates to the resource. User's location to the subject. You can see the relationship building up again. And finally, in the segregation of duty check, the user identity as an attribute of the subject category is compared to the PO purchaser identity, the resource attribute. And before we move on to the demo and we see the authorization policies in action, let's talk a bit about the Axiomatics product suite. Gerry?
Thanks, David. And I think you're also going to show some advanced reporting capabilities in addition to those 3 scenarios that you just described.
That's correct.
Good. So some of the technology behind the demonstration from the Axiomatics side, first will be the Axiomatics Policy Server. So this is the technology that will enforce rules regarding who can see what menu items and as well as who can execute certain web service calls within the application. So this is the technology, the ABAC approach that's appropriate for direct questions where the answer back to the application is going to be a yes or no, that is a permit or a deny. The second technology you'll see in action is the filtering capability on the data within the database. And in this case, we have a Microsoft SQL database for this demo application. So this is what will intercept the call to the database and then append it or modify it according to policy so that the data returned will be the appropriate data, appropriate rows for that particular user. We also have a policy auditor tool for analyzing the example policy. We won't be seeing that in the demo today, but that's another capability in our authorization suite. So a little bit more detail about the architecture for the APS product, the Axiomatics Policy Server. You can see here that in the flow of the access to the application, you have what is called a policy enforcement point. It connects with the policy decision service and returns the permit or deny based on all the attributes involved in the request. You know, the user identity, the document information, and the policy decision service can also look up additional information, as David will be showing in the demonstration. And so this is what returns the permit or deny kind of response to the application. So ADAF, as we call it, is here on slide 14. As you can see in the architectural diagram, the user makes a request to the database. The proxy element in the system intercepts that SQL statement. It makes a call to the ADAF filter service, where it examines policies and other metadata about the user or about the resource and dynamically generates this where clause that gets appended to the SQL statement. Then the ADAF system gets out of the way, the SQL statement executes, and now the data that's returned to the user is only the data that they're authorized to access. On to the demo.
Thanks, Gerry. So let's have a look. Before we dive into the demo, let's have a look at how it's been built. First of all, it's a 3-tier application. We have a web portal. It's a very simple set of ASP.NET pages. We're talking about the .NET Framework version 4. With those pages, we hook back into a WCF service in the back end. That also includes the business tier. And that WCF and the business tier layer, in turn, call a data tier, which happens to be a Microsoft SQL Server database, as Gerry mentioned. Now, the question is, where do you do the authorization, and what authorization do you want to do? With the logic that we saw in the initial rules, we saw that it was actually fairly complex to write the right code, the right .NET or C# code that would implement correctly the authorization requirements. Also, if you write code and if the requirements change, you have to change your code. Lastly, you would have to write your code in multiple locations, in the ASP.NET page, but also in the business tier, and also potentially in some way in the database through procedures or other techniques. And that leads to messy code, code replication, and something really hard to maintain and get visibility of. In comes externalized authorization, or I should say out goes the authorization into a layer of its own, externalized authorization. And this is where the products that Gerry has just introduced will step in. On the one hand, the Axiomatics Policy Server for everything that deals with direct authorization in the application tier, in the API tier, in the presentation tier. And for the data tier, we use the Axiomatics Data Access Filter. In the demo, the first thing that we'll do is control widgets, presentation widgets, menus, buttons, panels. And that will lead to a call to the Axiomatics Policy Server. Can I display this widget? Yes, you can. No, you can't. The second call to the Axiomatics Policy Server will be to control access to the API, the WCF API, and all the business functions that might reside behind the API. Again, it's a binary call. Can the user call this function? Can the user call the approve function or the edit function? Yes, they can. No, they can't. Lastly, in the demo, you will see an example of data filtering and data listing that is achieved through filtering of the data via the data access filter technique, where a proxy in front of the database calls out to the data access filter, gets the where clause back from the data access filter, appends it to the original SQL statement, and executes it against Microsoft SQL. In this demo application, you can see standard widgets, you have a title, you have a menu item, you have different items here on this white panel, and notice in the top right corner that I am not authenticated. In this demo, since I'm using ASP.NET, authentication is handled by Active Directory in the back end, but any other means of authentication would have done just as well. If we look at the menu items right now, I can click on the home menu item, I cannot click on the purchase orders item, nor can I click on the sales menu item, and I can click on the about link. Now, this means that we've protected the menu item to disable the two menu items in the middle. Because we're not logged in, we don't know whether the user belongs to purchasing or to the sales department. Therefore, we're disabling those menu items. Let's go ahead and pick a user, Carol. Carol belongs to the purchasing department. Let's go ahead and log in. And now that I'm logged in, let's try to go to the purchasing menu. And yes, sure enough, she can. And she can also click on the execute new. So she can create a new purchase order. Well, yes, we said that users in purchasing can create purchase orders. Can she open up the sales menu item? Yes, she can. So the question is Carol also in sales? Let's check our attribute sources in the back end. This is the Microsoft standard AD browser that comes with Windows Server 2008. I can go ahead and browse to my users folder and look for Carol, right-click, check her properties, and look at her department. You can see that she belongs to both purchasing and sales. I can go ahead and change the value, click Apply, go back to my web app, refresh this URL, and on the fly, she's lost access to the cell menu item. This is runtime authorization that does not require you to log out of the application for it to take effect. There's no caching. It is runtime information all the time, and that provides you with better security, of course. Now, we mentioned in the introduction to the demonstration that we would also have a look at a list of purchase orders. Before I do that, let's go ahead and inspect my backend database. Let's connect to SQL Server 2012. Let's expand my databases folder, focus on the Acme database, expand the tables folder, and let's have a look at the purchase order table. And I'm going to right-click and edit top 200 rows. As you might notice here from the bottom part, from the footer part of the table, there are in total 100 records in this database. So what happens now if I go to my web portal and I go to the purchase orders menu item and I click on list? In the back end, the data access filter is triggered, a where clause is produced to filter the records that the user is allowed to view. And as you can see, of those 100 records, only 5 were allowed. And if you inspect each one of those records, you'll notice that they all have one thing in common. As a matter of fact, in this example, 2 things in common. Number 1, they're all not approved, and that is not relevant in the authorization, as you saw from the authorization policies. And number 2, their location is Maryland. If you remember the authorization policy we had defined, managers in purchasing can only view purchase orders that belong to the same location, to the same state. This must mean that Carol belongs to Maryland. Let's have a check at Carol's attributes. We go back to Carol, click on Properties, click on Physical Delivery Office, and yes, she's in Maryland. What if we move her to Vermont? Click Apply, go back to the web portal, hit the refresh button, and now the list of cars is different. We only have 4 cars. But we can also change data in the database. We don't need to always change on the user. So we can go to the database and say that the car here in Maryland, I'm going to move it to Vermont. Let's go back to the portal, hit refresh, and now you see 5 cars, one of which used to be in Maryland, now moved to Vermont.
David, another thing that's interesting to note here is that you don't have to change the policies. So the metadata about the users or the metadata about the resources can change as they typically would in day-to-day business activity. But in your examples here, the great benefit of an ABAC model and an externalized authorization model is that the system is dynamic enough to handle that. You don't have to change any of the authorization rules.
It's a very good point, Gerry. Thank you. Indeed, we haven't played with the policies yet at all. We haven't opened them up. The only thing that's changing here is attributes. Let's now have a look at the last record here that we're displaying. This record was created by Carol, and its amount is a fairly high amount, and it is located in Vermont. If I click on Details, it brings up a screen where I have the potential ability to approve the purchase order. Now, if you remember the authorization policy we designed in the slide deck, we said that a user can approve a PO if and only if they're in the right location, if and only if the amount is less than the approval limit for that user, and if and only if they did not create it. And if you look at the approved PO, I cannot click on the button. So the widget's been disabled. The function in the API in the backend has also been disabled for Carol because she's not allowed to approve the PO. But in addition to preventing the user from approving the purchase order, we've also added a feature which is to tell the user why they cannot approve the purchase order. And that's a feature of the XACML language called advice and obligations. Advice and obligations are additional information that can come back with a decision, with a yes or a no, and that can help enrich your business flow. In this case, we use an advice to give the user a notification, as a matter of fact, to give the user 2 notifications as to why the user cannot approve the purchase order. The first notification is, sorry, you cannot approve PO XYZ because you created it. This here is the segregation of duty rule that kicked in and returned the advice to the user to let them know why they cannot approve it. The second notification is, sorry, you cannot approve PO XYZ because your approval limit is not sufficient. This is the approval limit check policy that kicked in and similarly returns a notification, an advice to the end user to let them know why they cannot approve a purchase order. We can go to the backend database and play with the amount of the vehicle. Now let me grab the vehicle ID and let's write some SQL. So in the new query, we're going to update the amount of my purchase order. So update purchase order, set amount is equal to 5,000, where identifier is equal to the value we copied from the web portal. Let's run it. We can go back to the web portal. Watch out for this amount. It is going to change. I'm going to hit the refresh button. Now the amount is 5,000, and notice how the second notification went away. And the reason why it went away is because Carol can approve for more than $5,000. We can check her limit in the database by going here and selecting the top 1,000 rows and looking at Carol. There she is. Carol can approve up to 10,000. 10,000 is greater than 5,000, therefore she could potentially approve the purchase order had she not created it. Okay, and one last touch to this demo is the ability to do reporting on the policies. Not only can you decide and enforce based on the authorization policies, but you can also do reporting, what-if reporting, and user entitlement reporting on those policies from a central location since all the policies are kept centrally. I'm going to log out of my standard user and log in as my administrator. Now, if you'll notice, the UI has changed. Here I get an administrator panel in yellow. This is again an example of applying authorization to widgets. If you look at the menus, I cannot open either the purchase order menu or the sale menu. That's because my administrator does not belong either to the purchasing or to the sales department. Now if I click on Generate Reports, I can choose to generate a report about users or about resources. And if I pick the first one, I can ask to see what Carol can view, what Carol can approve. And if I run the report, it replies to me in a pseudo-English way, whereby Carol can view purchase orders that comply with the following restrictions. The location of the vehicle or the location of the purchase order must be Vermont. Yes, if you remember, Carol moved to Vermont. And Carol can approve purchase orders that comply with the following restrictions. The location must be Vermont, and the amount must be less than 10,000, and the purchaser must not be Carol. What about other users? Well, let's try Barbara. What can she view? What can she approve? Barbara can view purchase orders in California and can approve purchase orders in California where the amount is less than 1,000 and the purchaser is not Barbara. What about the administrator? Can he do anything? No, he can't. We're verifying that the administrator cannot work on purchase orders. Okay, so this is the user-centric view. What about the resource-centric view? Who can work on a given purchase order? Let's have a look. And let's select at random this vehicle here in Vermont. Who can view this vehicle in Vermont? Both John and Carol can view the vehicle in Vermont. Who can view the vehicle in California? Barbara. This is a way to identify which users have access to which particular resource and for which particular action within the system. This is extremely concise auditing of the authorization policies.
And David, one other thing to point out here is while this demo used data that's relevant to cars and purchase orders, I hope the viewers can understand or relate that it would apply equally well to insurance claims records, to banking information records, a variety of different kinds of use cases, because these are very typical rules about who should access what kind of data and under what circumstances. And with the end of the demo, I think we can close with some additional remarks here and talk about the value of externalizing authorization from applications and why the ABAC model is so valuable. And I think what we've been able to show here today is meeting the challenge of enabling the proper access to data, enabling sales people to view sales account records, and especially on the purchase order side, showing a variety of different rules that can be enabled, because it's not just based on who the user is, but a number of other factors: their location, whether they created the record or not, the state they're assigned to, and so on. And these are the typical kinds of access rules that business people think about. It's not just an IT perspective. So the ABAC model really allows that to be easily implemented for a variety of scenarios. And some of the other benefits that we think are relevant to this kind of approach here, David also showed how a single security model is implemented throughout the entire stack of this three-tier application. So you only have one policy language to deal with, and you can protect all aspects of the application and the data that's served by the application. And this last part of the demo showed you how we can do some extensive audit and reporting. And again, it's based on analyzing the access policies that are centrally defined and managed, so you can actually prove that your authorization is living up to the business security and privacy rules that you may have to adhere to. And that goes to one point further down here about compliance, being able to meet your internal as well as your external rules for these various kinds of regulatory regimes that almost every organization has to abide by. I also wanted to point out business agility, because we're actually incorporating business data into the access control model. So you're not creating IT artifacts or entitlements. Rather, you can utilize the business metadata to enforce access, and you don't have to change the access policies, as we showed in the demo today. And finally, lower cost of ownership. Costs and expenses are an issue for every organization, and we think this kind of model is very efficient for building and deploying applications, as well as their ongoing operation and maintenance. So it's a very low-cost, low-impact model in most scenarios. So I think, David, that's going to conclude our demonstration today. Thanks, everyone, for watching us. And you can always reach out for additional information and additional details, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you very much, Gerry. Thanks, everyone, for watching, and see you next time.